Welcome to St Bartholomew the Great, London's oldest parish church, the perfect setting to talk about one of the great works of Western music and religious music, Bach's St John Passion. I'm Zeb Soanes, here with members of the Academy of Ancient Music, Laurence Cummings, Persephone Gibbs and Nicholas Mulroy. Laurence, there's so much to talk about. I fear we're going to be dancing all over the place, but I want to talk to you first of all. It's an extraordinary work. It celebrates its 300th anniversary either last year or this year, depending which version you're using. But despite being 3 centuries old, it hasn't lost any of its urgency. Why is that, do you think?
Well, Bach, when he wrote it, really wanted to tell the Passion story in the vernacular. So that's why it's in the German language. And although we're performing in England, nonetheless, you get that sense of urgency about wanting the text to be really, really clear and to tell this story. And of course, it's so full of drama. And, you know, one could argue it's a mini opera. It's a religious opera because the drama is so well wrought, and every moment the tension builds to such a great sense of the narrative. There's a moment of aria for you to reflect, or either to take that feeling further, or to reflect and meditate on it.
It feels as if Bach is so aware of his audience, if we can call them that, his congregation, and those theatrical techniques, because just when everything is getting too intense, as you say, he gives you a moment of pause and of grieving often as well in the piece. Yes,
and the thing I'm always really keen to replicate, in a sense, from the original performances, the musicians would have all been in the gallery, so for the congregation it was theatre of the mind. So they were able to sort of just develop the characters in their own imaginations and allow the music to tell the story, and so that brings that element of drama to the fore.
I get goosebumps whenever I hear those opening bars, because you get this, I mean, if you know the piece, you know what's to come. There's this tremendous sense of foreboding. When you performed it 3 years ago, I think the Times described it as rare and rich, and for your next performances, you were blessed with 6 outstanding soloists. One of them is with us. Nick, you play St John the Evangelist. Is it daunting taking on such a great biblical character?
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's obviously a very famous story, you know, that, full of pathos and tragedy, but also the points at which Bach decides to press pause, where he says the congregation reflects and meditates and contemplates, which is a really important part of the Lutheran faith, is that sense of having to reflect before you even pray. He's an expert at sort of manipulating his audience in that way. I think it's interesting what Laurence says about the congregation rather not seeing the performers, because the most important action that happens really in the piece, rather than what happens to Christ on his journey, is actually what happens to the listener in their mind. So what Bach wants to do is, it's even a line in one of the chorales, is stir up our consciousness into a different state, really. So that's the first thing, is it's an act of kind of like a sort of an act of conversion, really. Yeah, that the congregation listens and learns and understands things better. The other thing about St John, which I think is interesting and is a really nice way in for me as a singer, is that there are often references to the disciple, the well-beloved disciple, who we think is St John. And so I take in the St John Passion particularly the angle that I'm Christ's friend, and watching him undergo all this stuff has a real effect on me and changes myself and my mind as well, which is a really nice kind of human detail to sort of go with.
And it is a very human drama. So how do you keep it grounded? How does Bach keep it grounded?
I mean, lots of different ways. It's very, very tightly structured. The structure is something extraordinary. And of course, we think of Bach as this amazing musical architect, which is absolutely right. But the other way he does it is he understands the listener's I think heart and soul. He understands how to touch the listener, how to manipulate emotions, if that doesn't sound too callous.
Well, it's a conjuring feat.
Absolutely,
actually.
yeah.
It's a very different telling than the St Matthew Passion, isn't it, Laurence? In which Jesus is the lamb led to the slaughter, but here he knows what his purpose is, his divine purpose. How does that come across musically?
Well, I think, I mean, it's a sort of it's an obvious comparison to put the two works next to each other. But I mean, the Gospels themselves are so different, and for me, the Matthew Passion is although it's actually a longer extended piece, it's more like one meditation, and the story is there to allow you to sort of go in and out. Whereas the telling of the John Passion is so dramatic and very immediate, I think, and nothing ever outstays its welcome. You're sort of caught up in a moment, and then you're on to the next, and it's this sort of drive of the story that comes through for me.
But the St. John Passion doesn't seem to get performed as much, and one shouldn't have a favourite. I do prefer it, but why do you think that is?
It's interesting that you say that. I mean, for a while it seemed like it was the other way around. I mean, I think. The Matthew obviously has larger forces because it has the two orchestras and the two choirs. But I think this is so condensed. I think it does get a lot of performances, perhaps not so high profile. I mean, I know a lot of choral societies do it because the choruses are slightly more manageable than the Matthew Passion, and it's so satisfying to sing. And of course, a lot of people here in the UK perform it in English, and I think there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, because Bach wanted it to be in his vernacular, and so why shouldn't we have it in our vernacular? We are performing it in German, as Bach would have heard it. But
I think one of the amazing strengths of the John is that even from the very first bar, you're kind of whipped into this, not merry-go-round exactly, because it's not very merry, but this inexorable thing that you're just on a...
It is, it's like a whirlwind, isn't it? And it's also like you open a huge door on something that's already going. Yes. Yeah. So it's kind of, and I always find that first chorus, although it's so epic in one sense, it's incredibly humbling. You think you sort of realise...
That's certainly true as a player. I was talking to a colleague of mine who plays bassoon. We just did one on Saturday, the first of the season. And on our journey home, she was saying how she and wind players in general find that opening chorus so physically painful and difficult, judging when to breathe, how to sustain, making sure that all of those harmonic clashes really tell, and how that physically takes a toll, and they never feel like they do it well enough. And as a string player, we see all these semiquavers on the page and so many accidentals, and the number of times you actually get every single note on the page correct probably is close to zero. But in a way, that's sort of the purpose of it, to make us all suffer and feel our humility within creating this much more...
But he creates incredible texture and layering with the instrumentation, doesn't he? I mean, particularly at the beginning, that opening chorus, there's so much happening in the bass, but layers of bass, kind of octave, but beneath octave, to give this sense of foreboding. How does he write for the violin? Oh,
it's just a turbulent royal of constant semiquavers, pretty much, until we then pass them to the bass, when they get to do the turbulent royal of semiquavers while we're providing the structure for them. But it's remorseless.
And there's if you like that sort of thing, there's an interesting thing about that, which is that that figure in the violins which gets passed to the bass is a circulatio, I think. And it comes back in the final soprano aria, which is effectively Mary cradling the dead Christ in her arms. And it goes across 3 octaves. So we get this sense of God as the circle, and then being taken down and buried. So you get the burial of God, which is seeded in the very first bar, almost at the end of the piece. So Bach has this amazing knack of structuring things, so we hear things in the past and in the future as well as the present.
Do we have a sense of how it was received at the time?
Well, I think it was. I think I've read one contemporary account that was in raptures about it. I mean, I think it got the seal of approval right from the start. Just building on what Nick just said, though, that this idea of recurring motifs is one of the things that really underpins the whole piece. It's the use of the rhetoric. So this story is told through these rhetorical devices, which, as a listener, you may not be aware of, but of course subliminally they're there. And as a performer, similarly, it's not that you're making the rhetorical gesture, it's just there. and you repeat the notes and you repeat the notes in the different forms, and they come out. And in your part, Nick, I mean, there are so many rhetorical gestures, aren't they? The way the intervals are. Yep. So, you know, when you're telling a sort of ordinary part of the story, the intervals are usually fairly close to each other, and then something striking happens, and it's a bigger interval. Yeah,
and very occasionally you get melismas, so just one syllable set to lots of notes, which is when it suddenly becomes very, very expressive and operatic, I suppose, for want of a better word. But often it's just speech rhythms. But he never does things by accident, I think. So even the rest, which in the score looks like he's just, you know, throwing it off very, very quickly, is incredibly well crafted and
rewarding to sing.
Phenomenally. It's not easy. Like I think a lot of his music has kind of inbuilt almost impossibility, but that's absolutely part of his, I think, his faith as well as the sense of
reaching for something.
Always directing things up there, and we are unworthy of God.
And he writes for some instruments, Persephone, which were old-fashioned at the time.
They were, yes.
And I think you've brought one with you.
I have. What he wrote was actually for two of these, and I'm only one, so we can't do a full demonstration. But he writes an arioso and an aria for the arioso is for bass voice, the aria is for tenor voice, accompanied by, among other instruments, other bass instruments, the two viola d'amores, or is it violas d'amore? And yes, exactly, gins and tonic. It was quite a popular chamber instrument in the 17th century, and in the early 18th century, there were still a few composers writing fairly prolifically for it. Vivaldi wrote about 100 concertos for it. Telemann wrote quite a bit for it. Graupner as well. Bach didn't use it much. I think there are a couple of cantatas that use it as well, but in the John Passion, he sort of sealed its place in history. But it was already growing obsolete by then, and in his last revision of the work, he kept revising the work up until the year before his death. He actually wrote in the option to play those arias on muted violins instead of these instruments, because he could see they were getting more difficult to find. There were fewer players who could switch to them.
And where did you find this particular instrument?
This was my lucky find in a pawn shop, not quite literally. I found it, one day I just was curious how much would a viola d'amore cost, and I was Googling, because when a student luthier is starting out, a viola d'amore is always their first project. So I thought there must be a lot of violas d'amore out there, you know, that students are making. But what I came across was an auction for an estate sale in Philadelphia, where I'm from, where my parents live. And that's where I found this. There was a woman in Philadelphia who was part of the early music movement in the early 20th century, which was when these instruments really had their renaissance. Hindemith was writing for them. The Dolmetsch and Casadesus families in Europe, in England and in France, were bringing back a lot of these obscure, obsolete instruments. And there was a group of people in Philadelphia who were doing the same. So the woman who owned this, when she died, her estate included the instruments, and I managed to get a hold of it. It's actually an old one. It's an 18th century one. It needed a bit of work, but it was my lucky find.
And the character, that's a blind Cupid, is it?
Yes. I don't know if the camera is going to be able to zoom in on it, but it's a traditional decoration for this instrument because of the name viola d'amore, to have as the headpiece a blindfolded Cupid. So. Yeah.
Could you tell us just about the stringing?
Yes, the instrument is constructed more similarly to a viola da gamba than a violin. It has a flat back, and like a viola da gamba, it has 6 strings, but unlike a viola da gamba, it also has sympathetic strings underneath, which I tune in a C minor scale. Some people tune them to match the strings on top, which can be tuned in, I keep mine usually in D minor. Some people tune it in C minor. It's very flexible what you do with it. Yeah. And the d'amore indication, I think, comes about to keep the nomenclature consistent with the oboe d'amore and the flute d'amore, which are also slightly bigger, slightly deeper, richer versions of the instrument. But when you look at the flame-shaped holes on this, and also the use of sympathetic stringing, it is very likely that the instrument was derived from an Eastern Islamic instrument, and that the name actually originally comes from the viola of the Moors rather than of Cupid and love.
Can we hear? It's such a treat to hear an instrument like this in
having
isolation.
so many strings, it is notorious for going out of tune in a cold church, but we can give it a go. So the beginning of your aria, or what could be your aria, if you're doing the arias as well as the recitatives. So it has a lot of resonance to it. Not every viola d'amore has the sympathetic strings. The very earliest ones had 5 strings that were made of brass that you played on directly. But those aren't as common these days as the ones with the 6 gut strings on top and the sympathetic metal strings underneath.
It sounds wonderful in this acoustic as well here. And the instruments during the St. John Passion are often underscoring what's happening in the chorus, because there's a lot of jeering, there's a lot of drama from the chorus. You have a moment where you're talking about Jesus' flogging, and the flogging is very clearly heard in the continuo. And it's the same, isn't it, for the strings as well, Persephone? Are there any particularly difficult moments?
Every violinist has a little photocopy of the number known as 16D with their own personal set of fingerings in it. And the flutes as well are doubling the first violin line in this. It's a choral scene, a chorus scene, where the crowd is jeering and getting violent and whipping themselves up into a frenzy. And the first violins and flutes have this completely bonkers line of semiquavers on top, which goes through the most odd harmonic shifts, and it's very difficult. Yeah.
Laurence, you're in charge directing the piece. You are, I'm sorry.
Yes.
And here we are, 300 years after the first performance. It's such a well-known and revered piece. How do you, as director, keep it vital, keep it fresh?
Well, one of the amazing things I think about the Academy of Ancient Music is that that's our mission for everything we do. When you put it like that, I can see that it seems like a bit of a daunting task, but in fact, there's always something new that attracts your attention. You discover something yourself in preparation that you're eager to try out with the orchestra and the choir and the soloists. So once we get started, it really is about telling the story. And even if you've done it many times, we always really concentrate on the text. I mean, we're performing in German, so we work on our German pronunciation, but not just the German pronunciation in order to get it correct, but the flavors of the different words. And Bach's setting of the rhetoric of that text, it's sort of, you discover it each time anew, and it never feels like you're recreating something, it's just, I think there's just something so overwhelmingly inspirational in the music that always makes you feel like it's the first time.
And how does the setting influence the way that you perform it? I mean, whether you're performing, I know you often perform it in concert halls, but how does performing it in a religious setting as opposed to a concert hall change the way you perform it?
The work has so much inherent drama in it. I don't think we would change it, and there's no sense of, oh, we're in a religious space, we must be pious. There's nothing like that.
And when it's performed in a church setting, how does the structure of the performance change?
Well, these days, when we perform the piece in a church, we perform it as we would in a concert hall, usually. We perform it as a work of music, begin at the beginning, have an interval, finish it, and that's it. In Bach's day and with Bach's purpose for the context in which he wrote the piece, there would have been a sermon in the middle, there would have been perhaps some congregational hymns, some other aspects to a full religious service, which is something we don't do now.
I mean, it's interesting because, you know, the other invidious comparison that gets made all the time is between Bach and Handel. And of course, Handel's great work for Lent and Easter is Messiah. And that is, you know, obviously telling the same story, but was intended for the theatre. Bach's Passions were written for church, but we're performing them at the Barbican Concert Hall. So there's a wonderful sense of just taking the initial context away and making it our context. And that's part of the way of keeping it fresh. So that I always like to think that someone in the audience might be hearing this for the first time. And what will their experience be? And that they should come, they shouldn't have to know anything. They should just receive what we give them in the humble spirit that we bring, because that is our duty. I mean, you know, we study many treatises and we do all sorts of wonderful research into stringing and articulation and voice, the relationship between the voice and the text. But at the end of every treatise, there's usually a line which says the duty of the musician is to move the soul of the listener. And that is our duty. And it sort of doesn't matter where you are. You know, you're there. Bach's music makes it a solemn, sacred space. You don't need an altar. You don't need to ask people what they believe or ask them if they agree with what you believe. It's not really about that. It's using this wonderful setting of a fantastic story to move our listeners and to hopefully take us on a spiritual journey.
Well, I hope that you get the opportunity to hear the Academy of Ancient Music perform this extraordinary work, or go and find a wonderful recording. There's an excellent one made by the Academy back in 2014. Laurence, Persephone, Nicholas, it's been wonderful talking to you. Thank you very much.